Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you all for coming today for our webinar on the Marseille Outcomes for Business and Nature. So my name is Sharon Brooks, and I'm the Deputy Head of the Business and Biodiversity team here at UNEP-WCMC, and I will be moderating today. So the intention today is to really take stock of the discussions and the outcomes of World Conservation Congress that was held in Marseille related to the role and actions of business. So this is a follow-up to the Business and Nature Hub that was held alongside the Congress to increase that dialogue among business and other stakeholders. So the Business and Nature Hub was enabled through a collaboration between IUCN, Fauna and Flora International, the Capitals Coalition and UNEP-WCMC, and made possible by the contribution of private sector partners. So last week, the next step of this journey was kicked off by the part one of the UN Biodiversity Conference, and the Business and Biodiversity Week will start shortly after this session, being led by the Secretariat to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And of course, we have the upcoming Climate COP in November and part two of the CBD COP next year. So we're really seeing this momentum build for an ambitious climate and nature agenda and increased recognition of the need for effective participation of all of our stakeholders, and businesses in particular are hugely important in this space. So it's therefore really encouraging to see so much participation from business in Marseille and to have that space for constructive discussions on practical steps and solutions that can be implemented. We had over 20 sessions in the Business and Nature Hub across the topics of measuring and valuing nature, implementing nature-based solutions, working across supply chains, strengthening the enabling environment to support business action. And today we're going to be joined by representatives of the organisations behind the Business and Nature Hub, as well as the Business for Nature Coalition and business representatives who are there in Marseille to share their reflections and their aspirations for the road ahead. We will have time for some Q&A at the end, so please do submit questions into the chat box or the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to direct those to participants later on in the session. So I would now like to invite the following people to join us who represent the four organisations that collaborated to create the Business and Nature Hub. So we have Gerard Bos, who is the Director of the Global Business and Biodiversity Programme at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. Pippa Howard, the Director of Extractors and Development Infrastructure at Fauna and Flora International, who leads their engagement with the private sector. We have Jonny Hughes, the Chief Executive Officer of UNEP-WCMC, and Martin Locke, Executive Director at the Capitals Coalition. So thank you all, four of you, for joining today and coming back to share your reflections on what sounded like a really exciting event. I'm only sorry I wasn't there in person. I would like to now turn to each of you to share with us exactly what were your key reflections of the Congress in terms of what are those outcomes and implications for business, and what your hopes and expectations are for that journey ahead to Glasgow and Kunming. So Gerard, if I could turn to you first, please do take the floor and share your thoughts. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. Thank you, Sharon, and dear listeners for being on this call. And thank you that we're still remembering Marseille and the wonderful 7 or 8 days out there. And if I would like 3 key bullet points to be remembered, this will be that. First, the increased need for radical collaboration between all actors. That's really what came out as a key element during the few days. The second one is the need for an economic and financial system to be reformed, to really integrate the biodiversity and nature risk alongside the climate risk, not in opposition to each other. And then the last point, which was very interesting as well, is to see the impatience that was of all the actors, and especially the business community that were at the various panels and workshops that we had, of acting now, even if the perfect science and data are not in place. So how can we actually start working on this now, whilst we're still figuring out the perfect science and data? And so overall, there's a Marseille outcome manifesto that was also published, which is reiterating some of these elements and making sure that we are respecting and harnessing the perspective of all agency, of all citizens. So that's why it was great to have cities, CEOs, but also the youth really there at the beginning, and indigenous people to be expressing their voices. And they're all asking for pursuing collaboration and partnerships. So that goes back to my radical collaboration point. Then countering the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic was also clearly another element, and where we think, and the business community really agrees to that, where it's about promoting investment in nature. And I was privileged to be in a nature-based recovery workshop with 20 ministers of environment from 20 different countries, there physically present in Marseille. And then finally, let's make sure that we are confronting the risk and impacts of the climate emergency. Let's not put it aside, but actually really look at how these both elements can work together. And this is, of course, of very strong importance as we run into COP26, in the next few days, and actually see how can we optimize the global response that requires action from all and for all to able to act. I'll stop here, letting my colleagues to add a little bit to their coloring of Marseille.
Thank you so much, Gerard, for kicking us off with that and talking of those needs around collaboration. Pippa, if I could turn to you, please do share your thoughts and build on what Gerard has started. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sharon and Gerard and Jonny and Martin about to come after me. So there's three things really I'd like to highlight. One is money, another is commitments, and then there's the supply and demand thing. So the overriding and rather intoxicating impression from Marseille for me is that business and finance sectors are starting to realize that nature is rather essential to the global economy, and more importantly, to their bottom lines. They're also beginning to realize that there is more to nature than a bit of forest or mangrove lost in their footprint, but that they are innately dependent on nature one way or another, and their effects on it are diffuse and far-reaching, deep into their supply chains and markets, and into their ESG risk profiles, and of course their investor ratings. So some have been aware of this fact for decades or more. Others are rather new at it, and the newer ones seem to be rather pleased with themselves and are all shiny in the way that they're promising the world, whilst those who've been taking this on for a bit longer are a little bit more die-hard and wry about without not wanting to tarnish their enthusiasm, because the realities of implementation are pretty tough. There are, however, a few things that worry me about the enthusiasm, and this starts with the fear that this may be rhetoric, more rhetoric. Many are saying, no, not this time. This time it's for real. And this time we have to do something now. And I guess the same would be said in Glasgow in a few weeks. You mentioned the COP coming up, and this is, big focus for everyone at the moment too. But I'm forever hopeful and pragmatic, and hope like hell that this is really the beginning of something meaningful, genuine, and actioned. And I'm delighted by the hundreds of billions of dollars that were promised by the banking sector for finance for nature. But what does this actually mean, Sharon? And how will those billions reach nature in the field? How will it provide the tools for conservation and ecological restoration and livelihood generation? Who will be the beneficiaries of those many millions? The banks themselves? Will the money circulate to make more money for money's sake? I struggle to see how the financing posed will genuinely fund the types of projects that are needed to activate and implement the millions of actions and activities that are needed to change the course that we're on. I'm absolutely delighted by the promises of Nature Positive and congratulate those companies that have made this commitment. It was fantastic for them to have those showcased. All of you know that I've been a champion, or some of you will know that I've been a champion for objectives-led frameworks for decades. And it's wonderful to see the WBCSD and the World Economic Forum and many others supporting and articulating a framework for nature positive. I love especially the crucial role that the mitigation hierarchy and the need to have net gain or net positive impact for biodiversity at the direct footprint level, and for this to extend beyond into the universe of our supply chains. And I think that's what Nature Positive is talking to. And the markets, like we have with scope 3 emissions for nature. But let's keep our feet on the ground and make sure that all that is happening in the space is genuine and implemented and is delivering conservation on the ground. I'm going to repeat this again and again. We can't wait for the metrics to be perfect or for the miracle one number that will provide us with a magical indicator for biodiversity so that we can all tell the world that we're doing our bit. there isn't one, because it's not really appropriate to have one single indicator. So we need to do our bit. We need to record and monitor what we're doing and make sure that it's meaningful by being relevant to the local ecosystem, into its integrity and function and resilience to climate change. We need to be more integrated in the way that we think about these things. And we need to make sure it's relevant to the landscape functionality and takes into account other players and other land users. And that's what Gerard was saying. We have to work in communities of practice, in complex contexts, at a landscape scale. We have to work with them, and we have to work together across the sectors. And we make sure that it's all relevant and nested within the sort of jurisdictional objectives, etc. We cannot we have to make sure that the business of nature is not just making business out of nature, but is essentially sustainably changing the nature of business. And then finally, Sharon, there's this enormous burden on the shoulders of civil society at this point. And as with the carbon markets, there's an emerging gap between the supply and demand. And the demand will be insatiable for fantastic, sustainably financed, fully resourced, capacitated, successful projects that are bending the curve of biodiversity towards those positive objectives that we are setting for 2030 and 2050 in the CBD goals. But how do we increase the supply of conservation projects of every shape and size and ecosystem and species imaginable to meet the increasing demand we're seeing to fill these promises of nature positive? What do those projects look like? Who will do them? How will they be delivered? And who will be the beneficiaries? And I know, for example, that I think it's about 307 projects that FFI delivers in the field, 99% are with local communities, working, with nearly 400 partners from business and NGOs and communities and universities and government. And funding's a constant struggle. So with short cycles and patchworks of co-finance intended to share the burden. So this model really does need to change, and the nature-based enterprises and nature-based solutions that will be part of this equation, the whole sort of business and finance sector are essential to this. They have to be part of it, and we have to make sure that bankers are not making a buck out of nature for the sake of finance and profit. It has to be about impact investment, in my view. So I feel, somewhat panicked by the burden of what needs to be done, but I'm feeling very enthusiastic and genuinely hopeful that, what's coming out of Marseille is on the right trajectory, but we have to be quite careful about how it plays out. Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Pippa. It's very, very really nice to hear that sort of drop of realism. I think it's very, exciting to be at this point where we've got so much momentum that we've never really had in this space, but to not get caught up in just that momentum without making sure that, I like the expression, keeping our feet on the ground. So thank you for that. Jonny, could I turn to you now to please share your thoughts of what you felt came out of Marseille and where we are going ahead? Thank you.
Great, thanks Sharon, and thanks Pippa and Gerard for kicking us off with such insightful comments. Yeah, wasn't it great? I mean, I thought the nature, the Business and Nature Hub was one of the most exciting and well attended aspects of the Congress, and I was very pleasantly surprised, I have to say, that so many people did manage to come together physically in Marseille and get together and share ideas after such a long period in what seemed like hibernation at times. So a few quick thoughts from me. I was left with this impression that we are well on the way to transitioning to a nature economy, which obviously stays within planetary boundaries, and within hopefully 1.5 degrees of warming. So that was the big takeaway for me from the entire Congress, is that I suppose you look back in a decade and a lot of the things that we were talking about then were quite theoretical. I think we're now well on the way to that transition. Maybe in the foothills of it, but I think we're making considerable progress. And there's now, as other speakers have said, an understanding that for businesses to understand their impacts and dependencies on nature is now an absolutely critical part of their core business, or has to become a critical part of their core business quickly. We also have to admit, coming back to Pippa's point about keeping our feet on the ground, that nature is definitely more complex than climate change. But we are getting there, and there's enough guidance now available to be setting targets and acting with urgency. So there's no excuse really to say, oh, we'll just wait until the next big number comes along or the next tool comes along. I think there's enough out there for businesses to act as of this current Monday morning or Monday afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. There was a lot of new data sets, metrics, methodologies that were launched in Marseille at the hub and in other places during the Congress. These included three, I'll pick out three at three different fundamental scales of nature. So the first one was the STAR metric, which is the species threat and abatement and recovery metric. The idea behind STAR is that it apportions the relative contribution of threats to extinction risk for a threatened species on the IUCN Red List. So what does that mean? It means that for a particular site or a land management unit or even an administrative region, STAR can show you the potential for reducing extinction risk before investment activities have actually taken place. Or it can also measure the achieved impact of conservation interventions on reducing extinction risk over time. So that is a major innovation. And it's a very, very impressive product that can be used now by businesses if they're thinking about making investment in a particular area. So at the site level, moving up from the species to the site level, we launched the biodiversity indicators for site-based indicators, which is the BISI, which supports companies to develop corporate biodiversity performance indicators that are scientifically credible and transparent and understandable by multiple audiences. This is initially focused on the extractives sector, but this work has been broadened in scope and has the potential for application for many other sectors as well. Moving up another level, there was a resolution on ecosystem integrity, and there's been a lot of work recently on the Ecosystem Integrity Index. Resolution 041, I think it was, which was calling for the inclusion of an ecosystem integrity measure in the new global biodiversity framework, which seems very likely to happen. So we've now got basically tools which are operating at a species level, a site level, and an ecosystem level, which are good to go, fit for purpose, and can be used today. I should also mention, of course, the Capitals Coalition UNEP-WCMC developed tool on biodiversity guidance to navigate the application of biodiversity and biodiversity inclusive natural capital assessments. This follows on from the Natural Capital Protocol, which is also, I think, a very useful tool to get going with should you want to do that with urgency, which I would highly recommend. So the way these and other existing tools are being brought together in initiatives include, everybody will have heard of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, noting that TNFD it's not trying to create a new disclosure standard, but it's going to promote the adoption of an integrated risk management and disclosure framework that aggregates the best of these tools and materials, some of which I've just been talking about now. So another good reason to start using them now rather than waiting for the deliberations of TNFD, I would suggest. Similarly, SBTN has been doing some great work on target setting. So interim guidance has already been published by the Science Based Targets Network, focused very much on setting targets now and then refining these in the future should that be required as technical work continues on difficult issues such as allocation and how we allocate the proportion of impact and dependency depending on the actor, for example, in a landscape. I must mention the Align project, which UNEP-WCMC is leading on, funded by European Commission and others, which is aiming to consolidate existing knowledge towards standardization of measurements, which is essential really to consistency and reliable measurement reporting and disclosure. And just finally, just looking forward, I think all of this is hugely relevant to the Global Biodiversity Framework, the draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Target 15, which may change a little bit, but I don't think it's going to change that much. which states that all businesses, public and private, large, medium and small, assess and report their dependencies and impact on biodiversity, including the extraction and production practices, sourcing and supply chains, and use and disposal. So it's coming. That is very likely to be adopted, or a target very likely will be adopted next year under the Global Biodiversity Framework. So I think what we need to hope for now is a really good, a greater push to adopt and enable some of those frameworks that I've just been talking about, many of which are now looking at the full value chain and not just working at the site level. So we've got a lot to go on. There's more technical development needed, of course, but that should not be an excuse for inaction. And I think that's probably my major takeaway message. And just to say to businesses which are maybe listening to kind of what they can do, listening out for what they can do next. I think your participation and continuing participation in the COPs, both the climate COP and the biodiversity COP, I think is essential to highlighting the usefulness of these metrics and measures and their adoption, and how they can bring about this transition that we need to make to a nature economy. So that's just some reflections from me, and back to you, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Jonny. Thanks for reminding us, I think, of all the huge effort and going on to sort of develop. And of course, this is not being done in isolation. This is being done in consultation with many businesses that are participating in the development of these tools, metrics and frameworks. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Martin, last but not least, can I please turn to you to share your thoughts? Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Sharon. And thanks also for my three colleagues speaking just before me. All wonderful points. So what to add as fourth speaker, you would say? Well, let me focus on three elements. I want to say something about atmosphere, something about value, and something about price. So three things. First, atmosphere. It was already highlighted, but being in the same place with over 7,000 people really was exciting. So it was a kind of a pleasure to host all these sessions together with the business community and the conservation community. One thing which really struck me was that the atmosphere between the two was so good, much better than I've seen the atmosphere to be in Hawaii 5 years ago at the previous Congress. And maybe this was because we came out of hibernation, as Jonny already referred to. So anyone who's seen polar cubs coming out of hibernation know they are quite playful. So maybe that was the reason why the atmosphere was so good. But to be honest, I think it was, and it is, because there is a mutual understanding that business and conservation need each other. We are in this together, and nature is also a business case, as Business for Nature is stating quite clearly. So, but nevertheless, this positive atmosphere really, I think, is something to be noted, and where I want to start with. My second element was on value. This builds on several of the comments made, including the last one by Jonny on target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. It struck me that all of the businesses that spoke, they are so convinced that they need to be very transparent on their impacts and dependencies on the value of nature. They want to include it in decision making, and they more or less said to the policymakers, mandated, this is what is needed. They also said that what they still need is the data sets and the standardization to really do this in a credible and aligned way. And one of my hopes is not only that governments are going to mandate disclosure of natural capital impacts and dependencies in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Of course, they then have to make legislation at the different country levels, but also that they are going to support business with support for standardization and capacity building in order to really enable them to follow this path. My second point, and to be honest, this was the point that really amazed me most in Marseille, was that several of the business leaders stepped forward and said that, yes, valuation is good, but there's a follow-up question there that really is needed too, and that is around the pricing of natural resources. Some of them even said it very explicitly, if we don't price the use of natural resources, the habits, the way we use nature will not change. I think this reflects very much also one of the key policy recommendations from Business for Nature, the global coalition creating one voice of business to advocate for very ambitious nature policies. That is that we have to ensure that the incentives in the financial economic system reward positive outcomes for nature. That has to do with tax, that has to do with subsidies that need to be rethought in order to ensure that they support positive outcomes. But at the end, it also has to do with the price we are willing to pay for the use of natural resources. And some of the businesses, again, really make that very explicit. I think they kind of walked a little bit, probably even before the troops in the business community. To me, this is one of the key challenges for the future. And I hope that the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, is willing to help us to start moving into this direction. I also think, and this goes back to one of the first points Gerard made, that what we really need for this is a radical collaboration. I mean, let's be real, the need to price resource use was already on the table in Aichi, was already on the table in Rio de Janeiro, to be honest. So this is a very long struggle. And the only way forward is if we kind of can tackle the vested interest. And the vested interests are all around us. But also the front runners in business, in finance, in government are also all around us, and we're especially around us at the Business and Nature Hub in Marseille. I think we need to collaborate together with all the front runners to really make this pricing, or formulated a little bit more general, a shift in the financial incentive mechanisms that we need a reality in the future. Thank you very much, Sharon. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you to Gerard, Pippa, Jonny, and Martin for sharing their thoughts. And I think actually those points, Martin, that you made at the end is a perfect segue actually into our next speaker, in terms of thinking about those incentive structures, that enabling framework. So what is needed to really have that sort of business voice, I think, in what are the policy recommendations going forwards. So on that note, I would like to invite Maëlle Pellison, who is the Advocacy Director at Business for Nature, leading the coalition's policy engagement around the UN negotiations on nature, to share with us a bit more information, I suppose, around the next steps that Business for Nature are taking to really further build on this momentum that we're all talking about, this sort of energized atmosphere that we had in Marseille and that we're hoping to continue going forwards into the various events that are following. So Maëlle, over to you. If you could share with us what are the next steps for Business for Nature, where are we going, and how is that going to sort of help drive this forward? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And I have to say, it's very encouraging to hear all the good discussion that happened in Marseille, and so nice to hear how excited and happy you were that you could all meet in person. I'm a bit jealous because I couldn't be there, but there'll be another time. So what I wanted to highlight as well is that after Marseille, another very important moment that took place last week was the opening of COP15, as it was mentioned before. And while it was more a political moment than actual negotiations on the text, I think it was a very important moment to place biodiversity on top of the political agenda one more time. So actually the CBD mentioned that 25,000 media articles were published about COP15 last week. And also personally, I received a lot of messages from friends and family, forwarded me article and asking if that's the COP you're working on. So that was, for a lot of them, the first time that they were actually hearing about COP15 in the media. So I think that was quite interesting. And we've heard now from all the speakers reporting from Marseille that biodiversity has also been growing very quickly on the business agenda. So we also wanted to take this opportunity of the opening of COP15 to demonstrate this business engagement. So we announced last week that more than 1,000 companies that are representing 4.5
I think we have lost Maëlle temporarily. Let's just wait a second and see if we'll get her back. We were warned of some technical.
This is on nature. Not
Maëlle, maybe if you want to turn your video off and see if your sound might be better. Okay, I think we have lost Maëlle. What we could do, I think, is maybe we'll wait and see if Maëlle will come back later and continue to share the insight she was providing. But maybe in the interest of time, we could move on and then we can come back to Maëlle's session in a moment. Yeah, okay. So it's really great that we've heard, obviously we'll come back for the Business for Nature piece. We've heard from the organisers behind the Business for Nature Hub. But I think what would be great now is if we could actually hear from some of the business representatives that were there in Marseille themselves. So I think what will be great for the audience to learn is really how did all of this sort of the momentum buzz that we're hearing about from all of the organisations, how does this resonate with businesses? How is this, how is, and what are the plans and the commitments going forwards? Many of the businesses that we have today are making many commitments around nature and around climate. And it would be great to understand from them. So I would like to invite the following people to join us now. So we have Magali Anderson, who's the Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer at Holcim. If I could ask you to kick off and provide with us your reflections on Marseille and where we're heading and what this means for you and your business. Thank you.
Yes, Sharon, thank you very much for having me, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It was a great Congress. I'm not going to repeat for the sake of time what everyone said, but I am fully aligned. Having the possibility to meet people in person and have that great momentum, that great tendency was fantastic. It was great to see how many companies were there and how the businesses was so much supporting, including the CEO Summit. So all of this was fantastic. But of course, for me, the big highlight was the fact that we announced our nature strategy. And our nature strategy was about the fact that we are making some very strong commitment, both on water and biodiversity. On water, in short, we take stronger commitment on reducing water withdrawal, freshwater withdrawal in our operations. But the main one was to say that we want to give back to nature and society every single drop of water that we use in our processes. I think that was really the strong one. And on biodiversity, the one I'm very proud of is that we really want to not only measure biodiversity, but we took a commitment on improving our biodiversity using a scientific-based tool. And that tool is called BIRS, and is something that was developed by IUCN with the support of Holcim some years ago. And basically the idea is to measure it. And finally, the last but not least bit, it's really looking at not only the supply chain, but also how do we build? How do we address the mega trend, and how do we reconcile nature in the cities? So I think for us, it was very important to see that, but to see as well that the measuring part, and this was mentioned by people just before, the measuring part is so important, because if you think of the success of the commitment on CO2 is really based on the fact that people know what to commit to and how to reduce it. So many businesses today wants to do the same with nature. They are not really sure how to do it, because we know that it's much harder than to measure nature. So we were really very happy, not just to make that commitment ourselves, but to see how many people wanted to do it and were engaged in doing it. We had so many discussions. I see, like with Martin and with Gerard and other people in Marseille, to discuss not just how an individual business can do it, but how we can scale it up. And for me, it's absolutely critical in the future that we does it very quickly. What we have done since, outside the announcement, we have been very honored to be chosen by TNFD, the task force for nature financial disclosure as a member of that task force. We are very close to SBTN as well. And finally, I think when Maëlle was stopped, she was certainly going to mention how there was this letter signed by 11 CEO, and we were one of them. So I think really, I'm so happy to see how the agenda is progressing, how the businesses are supporting it. And I thought the Congress was really an excellent platform for it.
Thank you so much, Magali, and congratulations on not only just sort of driving that sort of ambition, but also that focus on sort of measurement and implementation. How can we make sure that what we're committing to is actually happening on the ground, and those challenges and to being able to sort of input into the development of these sort of methods. So thank you for that. If I could turn to Helen Crowley is the head of sustainable sourcing at Kering. Please, could I ask you to share your thoughts of Marseille? Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Sharon. Hi, everybody. Great to be amongst you today. Thank you for asking me to be part of this. It was terrific being in Marseille. It was, as everybody said, and Martin said, the ambience was really impressive. It was exciting, coming out of hibernation and playfully and intellectually engaging with people again. So it really was very special time. And I would say it was also an extremely special time because it became very clear, having been involved in many of these IUCN congresses, that this was different. Things were different now. It wasn't just about post-COVID. There was an engagement and an awareness from the private sector, and I will get back to the private sector again in a minute, that wasn't there in previous IUCN congresses. And there was a willingness from both sides to really engage in collaboratively and co-create, I would say, not just collaborate, but co-create the solutions, because it's complex, as you've all highlighted. So I think things are different now was a really important element of the Marseille Congress, things in terms of the level of awareness and the willingness to engage from a vast array of private sector entities, not just supply chain companies like Kering and not just in infrastructure and important companies like Holcim, but investment companies and so on. So there was a really, that was really important. The next thing though is how. And I think this is where it's great that we know that we want to engage and that there is this willingness to co-create and collaborate. There's an understanding of the risk if we don't from private sector. There's also an understanding, if a little nascent, to Martin's point, of the value proposition of really engaging and doing nature positive. I'm not just talking about financial value proposition, the full value proposition of integrating of those externalities, of acknowledging that to be nature positive, we have to do things different, we have to value things differently across the board. But when we do that, there's an opportunity to create a narrative, to mitigate risk, to create real value for the company. So I think there's still more work we need to do on articulating that value proposition and how companies can really, really sort of engage in that and build that out. So that was one thing. I think the other bit about how is that I think these frameworks, there are 3 levels of frameworks. To echo a little bit what Jonny was saying, there's a framework for measurement. There are great advances in how we can measure and track different elements of biodiversity and nature impact. I think there are frameworks, and Jonny highlighted those really well, and of course there are others. There's frameworks for disclosure. So you've got the TNFD, the TCFD, and there's frameworks for actions, the SBTN. So I think those 3 frameworks, we need to work more with companies to help them understand how they engage in those frameworks and the synergies across that. What you measure where, how that reports back into a target, and then how that reports out as a disclosure. So I think there's some really good and exciting work to do on that. But one point I wanted to just highlight as I finish up is also the how, is that I think the time is now to get more specific and granular. Because we talk about the private sector, we talk about changing business models, we talk about the need for a new financial paradigm, and I agree with all of that. But let's get we talk about things like the financing gap of the 700 billion that we need to finance nature, and that's all very real and important. But now we need to step down and say, who does what? Right? So the finance sector is responsible for engaging in certain things, or could be engaging in certain elements. To Pippa's point about conservation and funding conservation, there are certain mechanisms and vehicles and entities that can improve flows of finance to conservation projects. But the playing field that I'm in when it comes to nature and caring is the agricultural forestry playing field. That's where we're in the 70% area. That doesn't mean we can't support the 30% of protected areas, and that's more of a philanthropic engagement, or however, there are mechanisms that we as a company could engage. But I think now we need to start getting a little more sophisticated in saying, like, well, okay, Caring, you're an agricultural based company. What is it that is the most important thing that you need to do to be nature positive, to contribute to the goals and the aspirations and the outcomes that we want in the next 5 to 10 years? So that's where I think we can get. That's where we've got interesting opportunities for co-creation, is getting very sort of granular and saying, okay, this is how we work in this part. This is what your role as a company. We launched it at Marseille, our Caring Regenerative Fund for Nature grantees. We'd already launched the fund, but we had the grantees announced. So that is our 5 million euro of a 5-year fund to improve regenerative and catalyze regenerative approaches to agriculture that include biodiversity conservation, that include soil restoration, that include connectivity across agricultural landscapes, is one way we're trying to get to nature positive, and we're hoping we'll get to nature positive. But I think we've got more work to do to get very specific on who does what in this big world of moving towards nature positive. And it's an exciting and opportunity for all of us to co-create and to get very sort of tangible with companies in their context and their relevance about what it is that they can contribute to and how we can work together to do that. So thanks again. Just a few high level points, but thanks again for having me here.
Thank you so much for that, Helen, and thank you for sort of helping, I think, draw those, starting with that kind of need for standardization, the role of those big frameworks and sort of collective action across the private sector, down to kind of how do we disaggregate that private sector, and what are those sort of granular actions that are needed within sectors and within industries. So thank you very much for that. And actually that's a nice segue into sort of moving to our last speaker from the business perspective, which is Mark Johnson, who's the strategy lead for business, biodiversity and nature-based solutions in the environmental sustainability team at BP. So very different sector. So Mark, please do share your thoughts. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Well, I'm probably going to mirror a lot of the discussions already, but three sort of key areas for me. First of all, absolutely, the Congress was hugely exciting. The energy behind the Congress, the enthusiasm, but also the focus on the need for urgency was really there. It was very encouraging, the open dialogue, and fantastic to see so many businesses actually engaging and being involved and actually presenting it in quite open dialogue, open space, but what they're doing on biodiversity, and seeing some of the companies in there. But, let's just not kid ourselves there. We are seeing companies, there's a lot of companies taking leadership, but there's this huge spectrum. Still a large number of companies and businesses who are really only just starting to get on this journey of biodiversity. We heard fantastic from Business for Nature. Over 1,000 companies have signed up to the commitments there. But in the UK alone, there are 6 million companies registered in the UK alone. So, we've got a lot of work to do to engage and really mainstream biodiversity across the business sector. But still really great to see that momentum building in the Congress, and obviously leading up to COP26 and COP15. The second one was about this whole dialogue of nature positive, which again was really energizing. And sort of I suppose the 3 key highlights was net zero for climate, nature positive for biodiversity, and collective action. And there were sort of the key words which I'm taking back to the executive in terms of what came out of the Congress. But it's really interesting in terms of that dialogue and that journey we're on. You know, businesses have taken probably 10, 15 years to really get to understand and start implementing what net positive or not gain is at a site or project level. But now we're immediately talking about, well, what is net positive, nature positive at a corporate level? What's nature positive at the value chain? So there's a big step there which we need to take. And of course, we need to take that much quicker than we have so far. So there's a big progress we need to be making there. But we need, what does it actually mean? What does it actually mean in practical terms? What does actually business need to be doing to be turning that nature positive dialogue into actual action? And that's my final point, is about the action. Absolutely, we need to be acting now. We can't wait for the metrics. We can't wait for the disclosure mechanisms to come out and finalize, because they will take time, and they will take time to embed into businesses as well, not just getting the frameworks out there. And the final point, nature is complex, but actually action for nature is not complicated. Businesses can take action now and start putting that into their supply chains, into their activities now, and that's what we need to be focusing on. So thanks much, Sharon, and look forward to further discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. And that's a very nice point to make. I think I like that the action itself is not complicated. That can happen now. So that's a very nice message to have going forwards. So thank you to Helen, Mark and Magali for the reflections from business themselves. I wonder if we could now try and come back to you, Maëlle, and see if the technology is going to be on our side to continue to take us through the business for nature journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And we talked a lot about collaboration, but my internet connection is not very collaborative today, so sorry about that. So I think you lost me when I was talking about, and Mark just mentioned it as well, the 1,000 companies that signed the Nature is Everyone's Business Call to Action, which is calling on governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss by 2030. But also during the COP15 opening, we took the opportunity to publish in The Guardian a letter that was signed by 12 CEOs, and Magali mentioned it, also signed by the CEO of Holcim. And all those CEOs are committed to align their business strategies to a nature-positive world. And that includes through assessing and disclosing their impact and dependencies on nature, not only through their operation, but also in the value chain, setting science-based targets, that was mentioned a lot as well, and investing in high-quality nature-based solution. But the main message of this letter to policymakers was that if we want to accelerate business action, policymakers need to adopt policies to transform our economic and financial system. And that's why the next step with COP15 and COP26 and the adoption of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is very important. And the CEO mentioned a few elements that need to be adopted at COP15, and that includes adopting a clear, simple, and ambitious mission that would commit all governments to reverse nature loss by 2030, and that could try to simplify a bit the direction and could be the equivalent of the 1.5 degrees for climate, but for nature. But we also need very clear roles for all actors, including businesses, to act. And they are calling on governments to adopt in the framework targets to embed the value of nature in all decision-making and disclosure, to eliminate and redirect all harmful subsidies for the environment, to align all financial flow towards a nature-positive world, and to ensure that the production and consumption footprints are within ecological thresholds. So I think that one of the comments we received on this letter was from the UK chief scientist of Greenpeace, who was saying about the letter, it's remarkable that we now have businesses telling governments to get their act together on conserving nature. And I think this comment really is a demonstration that bringing a progressive and unified business voice in this political discussion on nature is very important, and it's our collective responsibility to do that. So just in terms of next steps and how we can continue bringing this business voice, so there's the COP26, as we all know, taking place next month, and the COP15 with the last negotiation meeting taking place in Geneva in January, and the COP15 itself in April, May in Kunming, China. So our call for all businesses and all of you is, like, if you are attending COP26, as a lot of us will, please make sure that nature is part of your narrative, that it is presented as a solution to climate change, but not only, it's also a crisis in itself. I can share in the chat a publication that we've published with Women Business that can help bringing these messages at COP26. And for COP15, Business for Nature will continue engaging very actively the negotiations and the negotiators. So if you want to attend, I mean, bringing the business voice in this physical and virtual meetings is very important. So if you want to join the Business for Nature delegation, please let me know, and we'll let you know when we're organizing a lot of bilateral meetings with governments. And as we're going along, we're also continuing to inform our policy position. So we just launched a business policy consultation to help us inform our policy recommendation. I think a lot of ideas came from Marseille as well. So we want to continue testing this with a broader group of businesses. So the consultation is open for all business, all geography, all sides and sectors to respond. It's open until the 12th of November. So I'll share the link in the chat for all of you to respond. And I know a few of you on the line have already responded. So thank you so much. And that really helps us developing our position to continue bringing this unified business voice. So I'll share all the links in the chat. Thank you so much, Sharon. I hope I'm still here with you.
Yes, it looks like technology is on our side at that time. So thank you so much, Maëlle. And it's wonderful to hear of all the sort of collective action that's happening in this space, and the dialogue to try and encourage more policy action to support businesses. So we now have a few minutes for any questions to our panelists. We haven't received any from the audience, I think, so far. But I would like to invite all of the panelists, actually, if they have particular reflections on some of the subsequent speakers, if they would like to raise their hand to sort of further this discussion. I think what we're hearing a lot around the nature positive sort of dialogue that's happening and the actions that's needed, but we're also, everyone's saying we need to act now, we can act now, we have the tools, but what is needed? What are the barriers to really help move this forward? What do we still need to encourage? So we're seeing some businesses that are coming forwards and making these commitments, trying to get that implementation going. But how do we encourage others to follow suit? Just see if I can see all of the participants, see if there's any hands. So Magali, can I invite you to come in? You've got your hands up. Thank you.
Pippa also had her hand up, but I will be very quick. I think it's really about making a framework, which is what a lot of people are working on. But at the end of the day, I think many businesses want to engage. They want to start working now. They're just a bit lost on how to do it. So we've mentioned the how. The big priority has to be that framework that everyone can align with and everyone can sign up to, and everyone can be accountable for reaching this target. If we could get that in the next few months, it would be fantastic. In the meantime, it doesn't stop us from working, but it would help a lot.
Thank you so much for that. Pippa.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with that. The framework's important. It provides the boundaries, I think, of what is and isn't part of the whole equation. But there's a really important need for, and I mentioned this on a call a little bit earlier today, a bit of matchmaking, actually. So, how do we match the capacity in the field, and how do we build the capacity of local communities or local community organizations, building that sort of institutional infrastructure that has the right governance, the right practical applications, that does what Helen is calling for and what Mark and what we're all calling for really is sort of the delivery mechanism for this, because we have a lot of good ideas on paper, but actually putting that into practice is really important. So the feasibility of what we're doing is important. That can only really hit the ground. And we're not talking about new massive protected areas. This is really hands-on, working with local farmers and building the soil capacity with more carbon and organic material. It's changing practices at that level, and that can only be done by people on the ground. So that's where I would like to see some of those actions coming in.
Thank you so much, Pippa, for highlighting that. I'm not sure on the order of hands going up, so I'm going to go. I think Martin, you have your hands up. Do you want to come in now?
Yes, please. It builds perfectly on Pippa's comment, I think. What we really need to do is stop talking about nature just by its own. And I'm not saying that we are doing that, because more and more the remark is nature and climate are two sides of the same coin. And then the third side to add to a coin, so this is not possible, it will be a cube, but people always has to be there. And a lot of the discussions in Marseille made it quite clear that we need to approach the challenges for climate change, nature, and social inequity together. Only then we will solve it. So people, I think, should be on the forefront always.
Great, thank you for that. Helen, do you want to come in now? Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Just to build on those great comments earlier, then I do think that this idea that companies are ready to act. I agree with Mark that there's a lot of companies that still need to build awareness and prioritize what they need to do. But I think showing by doing will also help catalyze that. So I think if the leadership companies are acting for nature, nature positive, for biodiversity, then that will be super helpful. I think there's plenty of no regrets actions that we can start on. I think the clarity that we need, and I do think this is starting to come through science-based targets for nature, but we need perhaps some more immediacy on that, on what is it that we can do. And I think the key here is to show where there's a synergy between, if you act for nature, you act for climate by doing these things. If you act for nature and you act for climate, people benefit in these tangible ways. So I think that it doesn't look like it's a whole nother thing to do, the nature agenda, but in fact, there's some sweet spots of overlap between what you need to do for climate, for people, for social justice, and for nature. And I think there's some real opportunities for highlighting those no regrets actions, those immediate actions for different types of companies in different contexts to do immediately and to commit to. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Helen. I know, Gerard, you have your hands up. I'm just going to read out, there was a couple of questions that have come in since
I'm going to answer these questions.
Answer that. Okay, great, thanks, Gerard. Over it.
So, great point made by all the speakers here, and it was great to be all together, where we've realigned a lot, on our narratives as well. But let me highlight three elements out of that. First, what I clearly remember from Congress and Marseille, and what was said by all the previous speakers, is that biodiversity is also in the productive landscape and is important in the built environment. And that's where then the link to the business community becomes much more easy and ready to action. And as Mark stated, these actions are not that complicated. And again, there are frameworks like the nature-based solutions, where you're addressing at the same time the societal challenges, but making sure that you are maintaining the ecosystem's integrity and delivering a biodiversity net gain. And what's very interesting is that the nature-based solution will offer multiple co-benefits on the social side, on the economic side, and on nature side. And it's actually making sure we measure this and show that. And then the last point I wanted to highlight, of course, we have a little bit of a focus on large companies, and it was CEOs of very large companies that were there, although the MEDEF head was there representing 190 companies, was there at the CEO Summit. But all these large companies have a way to reach out to their customers, to their suppliers, the consumers, and their neighbors, which is a myriad of much smaller enterprises. So it's, again, these collaborative approaches at all different levels. And just answering very quickly the two questions that were on the chat. I mean, we don't need to think about just net positive. Let's go full blast positive action agenda. Let's not tingle ourselves with offset. And the next steps for World Conservation Congress or World Parks Congress, well, it's every 4 years, although we did it 1 year later. So we are considering if we do it in the next 3 years, but there will be a next World Conservation Congress and there will be a next World Parks Congress, but we'll keep you informed on when that happens. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Gerard, for that. I think there was one last question. I know we're just about out of time, but is there momentum towards a specific metric for biodiversity? Would anybody like to just come in and answer that question? It's the holy grail of questions, I think, that's been there.
I think, yeah, Sharon, if I could, I think that question in some ways was probably answered actually by several people saying that nature's probably a little bit too complex to boil down into a single number, but we might get, a very few core numbers that we might that we might be landing on next year through the Global Biodiversity Framework process, based around those three scales that I talked about of species, sites, and ecosystems. There's also, of course, the genetic dimension to this as well, which has not been mentioned today, which is very important. I've just got one final reflection, which was to say, I'm not quite sure that we've nailed the "this is where to start" guide between us. You know, I mentioned lots of different measurements, metrics, tools, approaches. It probably is a bit bewildering and confusing to the business world at the moment, whereas it's probably simpler in the climate world. And perhaps we all need to come together and have a you know, if you're thinking about doing this, and we hope you're thinking about doing this, this is where to start. This is how to go about it. It's almost like a little decision tree. We've probably got that, but we need to be, I think, consistent in the way we communicate that across all the different organizations working in this space and all the different business leaders, actually, some of which are on the call, that we can, if we can speak a bit more consistently about this is how you go about it, this is where to start. There's no excuse, actually. You've got, you know, there is stuff available for you to work with. So maybe we should look at that.
Great, thank you so much, Jonny. And thank you to all of the speakers today. Apologies, we have run over slightly, but thank you everybody for sharing your reflections. I personally feel positive and energized after that session. I was sorry I wasn't there in Marseille, but I managed to sort of at least benefit from hearing you all speak about how positive it was and all this sort of commitments and action being taken. So, and, you know, as mentioned, we're really on this journey now with very many events and big conferences happening over the near term. So there's to really try and raise that ambition. So thank you all for your sharing your thoughts, and thank you for our participants today for joining. And just to thank all of the collaborators behind the Business and Nature Hub and those that supported it from the private sector as well. And as I mentioned before, the Business and Biodiversity Week is about to start. I think today's session is on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the role of business, all very relevant to the discussions that we've been having here today. So thank you everybody for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day or your evening or your morning. Thank you.
Thank you.